We'll talk consensus comparisons on today's show. We'll talk about players who have higher, including Luke Misa, Zayne Parekh, and more. We'll also talk about some players who have lower in terms of Carter Yakemchuk, Artyom Levshunov, and more players on that side as well. All coming up on today's show on Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi Kalakesh, joined by Sebastian High. And on today's show, we'll be talking consensus comparisons. We'll talk about players that Sebastian and I and our Dobber Prospects team overall have higher or lower than consensus. We'll start with the players we have higher. We've got a lot to cover. We'll talk about Luke Misa, Zayne Parekh, and a couple other players here. And in terms of players we have lower, we'll get into that later on with players like Carter Yakemchuk, Artyom Levshunov, Cole Eiserman, and Artyom Levshunov. We'll get into all of that on today's show. But before we get into it, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It's always very much appreciated. So let's get right into it, Sebastian. We'll start off here with players we have higher. Consensus is a bit of a weird word. It depends on what you kind of apply to the consensus here, because especially early on, a lot of outlets have various and very wildly different rankings regarding players. But I feel like one player we have mainly above consensus would be Luke Misa. We can start there. On our Dobber Prospects rankings, which either have already come out by the time you're watching this or will be coming out fairly soon, we have Luke Misa at 16th overall. And I feel like this is a decent range for him. This is more or less about where I'd have him, and I'm very comfortable with where he ended up here. Misa, I mean, I have trouble seeing what other outlets don't see with Misa. I mean, he's a player who plays the game at such a high speed, processes it at such a high speed. Every one of his decisions is made on the fly. He doesn't need to slow down to make decisions. He doesn't need to slow down to corral pucks and make plays. So it's just, you already have a player who plays at an NHL pace, and even maybe higher than an NHL pace. So what gives here? What do you think kind of holds him back from other rankings so far?
I mean, he is an undersized center, which
Yeah.
I think is the immediate thing that comes to mind there. It's also early on in the season. Yes, he is the brother of Michael Misa and therefore has a little bit bigger of a spotlight than the average OHLer. But like, his production's been excellent this season. He's had the offensive flair to back up the skill. He uses that flair consistently to create advantages. It's very, very purposeful. And he's not one for empty calories. Everything has a purpose. He's quite controlled in how he uses his high pace, which I have a ton of respect for and something that I value a lot in young players. So he was a player that, as we discussed in yesterday's episode, I thought that I'd have to kind of bring up around the 20 range to kind of put my foot down and stop the fall, because he's a player that every time I've watched him, I've seen a player that I would personally rank in the teens. I've seen a highly impressive, skilled, dynamic, and more than anything, pacey player that I think can bring a lot of value to the ice. And that didn't have to happen. He came out quite naturally in our discussion around 16th overall. So I was really happy with where he landed, that I didn't even need to make much of an argument in favor of him to get him in that range, because he was one of the players. Like, I probably had a short list of like 4 or 5 guys that I kind of wanted to have in certain ranges, and Misa was one of them. And I thought I'd have to pick my battle, and I would have picked the Misa battle, but I didn't have to, which was great. So I was glad where he landed on our board, but it was also definitely indicative of the lack of like kind of slam dunk top 20 talent that there is after a certain point around like the 12 to 13 range in this draft. So it kind of just got made wide open, and Misa benefited from that in our rankings for sure.
Absolutely. Another player we didn't really talk about before the show, but now looking at our rankings, I can see pretty high compared to others, is Igor Chernyshov. Chernyshov at 12 is definitely at 12 is definitely higher than I thought he would, that I've seen from other rankings. I mean, I'm looking at Corey Pronman, Scott Wheeler's elite prospects as well. He's kind of in the later teens. And we have him at 12th overall. I think he could have gone higher as well. He could have been in that 9-10 conversation as well. So there's a lot to like about Igor Chernyshov. I mean, he's a player that already plays such an adaptable role on a KHL team when he has been playing the KHL, and the MHL. It's not fair. He should not be playing KHL minutes. But on top of that, I mean, he not only adapts to his role, but also plays in a way that you could definitely see work in the NHL. His small area playmaking is really good. His skating is superb for a player of his size. He gets pucks from the boards to the middle consistently. And regularly makes these transition plays and facilitates these transition plays really, really well. So overall, I think that the mature base of skills with Chernyshov on top of the playmaking upside really makes him interesting and puts him in that kind of European power forward role we've been seeing more and more recently. So I'm excited about him. But a quick word on Zayne Parekh, because I don't think I've seen him anywhere in the top 10 on any other ranking. On ours and could have gone third. I mean, you were making a push for him as well. Yeah, I love him, but talk me through what you like about Periscak and what puts him in this conversation.
I don't think there was anyone in our meeting that had watched Periscak that had any inkling of aversion to having him inside our top 5. He had almost unanimous support among our scouts. In my eyes, he's the most exciting player in this draft class to watch and to scout. He's so dynamic, so skilled, but he's so much more than those things too. He's so intelligent. He's a really effective defensive presence. He's playing in every situation with Saginaw, and despite a slower start with that team than expected, has played very, very, very good hockey. And as you said, I think both me and our USA scout David Sod would have personally made pushes for him at 3, but with the strength of the arguments for Sam Dickinson in that slot, coming from mainly Jordan and yourself, it was kind of just like a sliver of difference in the enthusiasm between our two camps. And on top of that, Jordan is the the OHL scout, and you are the NA director, so you guys had dibs on that ranking. But it's a tight top range, and Zayne Parekh is a player that we have so much belief in to become a high-end offensive defenseman who does not hurt his team in his own zone. The fact that he got basically a full season of mentorship from Pavel Mintyukov, I think, is fantastic. And he really kind of took over that offensive role in Saginaw after Mintyukov was traded at the deadline last year to Ottawa. But he's a ton of fun, extremely exciting, dynamic player who probably has the highest upside in terms of point production from a defenseman that we've seen in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the production is one thing, but the way he scores every single point he gets is just, it's so impressive. Quarterbacks have power play to perfection, the offensive skill, the dynamism, the composure on the puck. Offensively, I don't really have any reproaches to him. It's just defensively, it's still a work in progress, but I've seen some progress there as well. So gap control's gotten better, all that good stuff. So he's been fairly impressive as well. Do you see him kind of sticking in this range or even pushing for third overall? Does this seem like the range is going to stay at all year, or is this just, we like this player early, we want to make a statement on that? Like, what is this for Zayne Parekh here?
I think personally, this is kind of where it's going to stick around. I don't know how it's going to be for the rest of the team, and obviously it depends how things shake out. I think there are a couple players that could make pushes to that could make guys that we have in the top 5 right now like slip out. I mean, on the one hand, if Cole Eiserman can diversify his game a little bit, I think there'd be a pretty solid argument for him at like 2 or 3. And on top of that, you have players like Caden Lindstrom, Consta Helenius that are kind of knocking on that door. But unless Zayne Parekh falls off, I don't really see a world where he's outside my personal top 5. And I mean, he's personally for me currently number 3 on my board. So I'm a massive fan of his, and I would have given him the slightest edge over Dickinson at this stage. I think that Dickinson is further away on the offensive side of the puck than Parekh is on the defensive side of the puck, and on top of that, Parekh has that like game-breaking skill element that very few blue liners have. And I think that he is a really high-end prospect in this draft class.
For sure. Yeah, fully agreed. And that wraps things up for our first segment. We'll get into our second, where we talk a bit more about some other players that we had a bit higher than consensus. We'll get into that right after these messages from our sponsors over at Game Time. If you're looking for tickets last minute to an event wherever you are, Game Time has you covered. They're really good in terms of finding you great deals at the last minute for any event, whether that's sports, hockey's, football, whatever it is. But as well, if you want to go to a comedy show, watch some theater, that kind of stuff, they've got you covered as well. I really like Game Time because my schedule is really volatile, so I can find myself with an afternoon free out of nowhere. And Game Time is really good for that because you can get tickets up to the last minute before the event, and even sometimes an hour after it starts. So it's really useful when you've got a wild schedule like I have. But yeah, Game Time is really good in terms of getting you some deals as well. They've got multiple deals that work really well for you, including zone deals, which I really like, where you pick the section and Game Time picks the seat for an average of about 18% of savings. And the Game Time guarantee means that you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less than what you see on Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. You get your total upfront, so you know exactly what deal you're getting without any hidden fees, and you can buy tickets in seconds with 2 taps. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, really simple. Just create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off at checkout on your first purchase. So download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Alrighty, so moving on to our second segment, we'll talk about a couple more players that we have higher than consensus. I wanted to start off with a very interesting name that we have here, Nikita Artamonov. He's a player who I mentioned to you early on, and he's a player that we got some passing glimpses of often when we were watching Anton Salayev because they play on the same KHL program. But Artamonov is playing extremely good hockey in the KHL. And I really like the way that he puts up his points. I mean, he's a player who has a lot of intensity, especially on the forecheck. The angles he takes on players on the forecheck are flawless. I mean, the way that he pressures players is really interesting in the offensive zone. But on top of that, he's got some sneaky good hands. He's got a great playmaking touch. He's got that short release, kind of whippy shot. Puck skills wise, nothing to complain about there either. It's not high end. It's not a Macklin Celebrini, Ivan Demidov level, but it's good enough that he's producing really well in the KHL as an 18-year-old. But yeah, I mean, I think the main concern with Artamonov is his skating is kind of on and off. The output is better than the input, but the input's really wonky at times. But yeah, talk me through that a bit. You've watched a fair bit more of him than I have, so yeah, take it away on him.
Yeah, I think Artamonov was a player that I kind of kept in my back pocket as a player who had an outside shot of cracking our top 15 because of that gap that we have between tiers that's pretty consistent throughout the first half of our first round. And so I caught a couple extra viewings of him going into our meeting just to be sure that it was a player that I personally felt comfortable with vouching for in that range. And the playmaking ability is really impressive. The overall processing speed at the KHL level does not stand out at all in that competition, which is a brilliant thing. Overall, I've been really impressed with kind of just seeing the smaller details in this game. I think that like the small adjustments he makes while under pressure now that he wasn't making when he was first starting out in the KHL demonstrate an increase in composure and calm under pressure, which is important and he utilizes very well. Because the input with the skating isn't the greatest, he's had to find ways of kind of problem solving in situations where his feet can't solve any problems, and he's kind of allowing his creativity to shine a bit more slowly, and that to me is another very promising thing to see a young player experimenting with creativity in the KHL while being fed like top 6 and top power play minutes. So watching him this season has been a ton of fun, not only because he's an entertaining prospect, but because of the amount of trust and leeway he's given as a rookie in the KHL, as a 17-year-old in the KHL. So I've really enjoyed watching Artamonov, and I was comfortable with him in that range for us, where he did end up falling in the mid-teens. And I'm very curious to see kind of how he keeps going this season. Like I think we'll see a lot in terms of just how much stamina he has throughout a season, because the KHL season's a lot more taxing than junior seasons are for draft eligible. So we'll see how he finishes off the year, and I wouldn't be shocked if he looks pretty tired. Same thing with Salayev, as we've seen with KHL prospects in the past. But the start of the season's been brilliant, and I think that he has the skill and the overall intuition and habits to justify that range for us.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you mentioned habits. I think that's the main kind of stream of thought when it comes to drafting Artamonov. Is if your organization values those small details, and recognizes them more often than not in young players. I'm thinking of guys like organizations like the Leafs, who have consistently looked for players with those small details. Eason Cowan, Fraser Minton, those type of players. I think that Artamonov could fit that mold really well. He's not the biggest at 5'11". He's not the tallest, but he's pretty stocky for his build at 190 pounds. And he uses it really well. I mean, his board battle mechanics are good as well, which really complements his intelligence on forechecks as well. Because you see a lot of those smaller players who are really smart on the forecheck. They identify when and how to apply pressure, but don't have the physical tools to back it up. I feel like Artamonov doesn't have that problem, and at least it's not been an issue at the KHL level. So I'd be very surprised if it's an issue in junior level. So yeah, Artamonov overall has been a very, very interesting and impressive prospect to watch so far throughout this early season. That brings me to another name we have here in our kind of higher list, and Terik Periscak. This is a player who I pushed for hard in our rankings, and he ended up at 20th overall. With Periscak, I mean, I talked about it in our scouting meet, but the name that keeps coming back to mind is draft year Nick Suzuki. And I don't mess around with these comparisons. The intelligence on Periscak has blown me away in every viewing. There's a reason why he has over a goal per game right now, and it's not because he has a booming shot. He's a poor skater by any metric. I mean, he's not a good skater at all. But he's consistently getting to spots before his opponents who skate better than him, who are bigger and stronger than him. And he's getting these one-touch goals consistently from dangerous areas. And usually, unless you're a really good skater, if you're constantly getting to spots before your opponents, it's just because you understand the game at a higher level. And that's definitely Terik Periscak. Beyond the goal-scoring ability, his playmaking touch and his intelligence in terms of finding passing lanes that no one else can see, I haven't seen much of that this year from other prospects other than Macklin Celebrini and Ivan Demidov. So the playmaking touch is fantastic. The hands are really good as well. And on top of that, he's playing penalty kill minutes. He's playing power play minutes. He's being trusted with these roles, and he's doing a really good job of them. He even has, I think, two penalty kill goals or something like that this season so far. So, he's getting involved offensively on the PK, but not sacrificing defense either, which is really hard to do when you're a poor skater. It's just it baffles me how this one major concern in his game, which is a major concern, granted, like if he was a good skater, he'd be in the top 5, but he's a bad skater, and that needs to be fixed. But Nick Suzuki was a really bad skater in this draft year as well, and improving his skating unlocked a side to his game that no one expected, and he became a top line center on the Montreal Canadiens. This is the type of projection that if you give him a really good scouting team, like, you can get that out of him. So that's why I pushed hard for him at 20, even though Luke, our WHL scout, wasn't fully on board. And there was a big glut of WHLers in that range. Ryder Ritchie, Tanner Howe, those types of players. For me, it was really important to put Periscak in that conversation. But yeah, what's your thoughts on that so far? And how do you see that comparison with draft year Nick Suzuki?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of player comps in general, but
Yeah.
I think as long as player comps are made specific, and such as draft year Nick Suzuki, I can see better links, right? Like what we often see is like, oh, this defenseman's the next Victor Hedman. Why?
Yeah.
He's big and skates pretty good, right? Like,
are we maybe talking about
they're
Anton
often...
Salayev here? I think that's what we're talking about.
We
right?
see that every year, Hattie. Remember two drafts ago? It was like 3 defensemen picked in the top 10. Yeah, it was like Owen Power, Victor Hedman. a couple other ones in that draft, or Victor Hedman
Yeah.
Thompson. I remember chuckling about that, but
Yeah.
but no, I think in terms of like draft your Nick Suzuki comp, I can see it. Like Periscak, as you said, is not a great skater, and that's going to need work. But the hockey mind there is really impressive. The consistency in finding space, both for himself to access, but also understanding how space works and how space like increases or shrinks depending on how defensive structures are moving, how forwards can attack them, how his line mates attack that empty space. And he often puts the puck in positions where only his teammate can get it. Like he passes like a quarterback does in football. Like he spots a target and he puts it often in a spot where the only player that can realistically get it is his own teammate, and those passes more often than not are completed. So I had no resistance to Periscak in that range. I was quite happy with just letting the WHL cluster shake itself out without getting too involved, as I've watched less of them than others in the meeting have. But I got Luke Misa in that range, and that was all I cared about. So, but Periscak's a ton of fun, and I think throughout the season I'm gonna try to zero in a little bit more on the toolkit itself, because I think the hockey mind is pretty well established at this point. Like I've seen enough personally as well to kind of back up the stance that he's a top 3 smartest player in this draft class. But the tools are kind of, I think, a bit more difficult to pin down specifically in terms of NHL projection.
Oh, for sure. But yeah, that brings us to our third segment, which will be coming up. We'll talk about some players that we have lower than consensus. We'll get into that right after these messages from our sponsors over at Chase Medical. With everything going on around the world, with supply chain shortages making it increasingly difficult to get access and reliable access to medication, Jace Medical is a great option in terms of finding you consistent access to medication that you can rely on and expect regularly. First and foremost, they have the Jace case, which is a case of 5 life-saving antibiotics that treat over 50 infections. From everything ranging from ear infections to nose to sinus infections and everything in between. They've got you covered. All it takes to get a Jace case is just to fill out a simple online form, and in some cases, just hopping on a quick call with one of their board-certified physicians. And before you know it, you've got a Jace case in the mail heading your way. On top of that, they can provide you with ongoing care with their physicians, and answer any treatment-related questions you have for any medications you order through Jace Medical. So it's a doctor-created platform, which is recommended by doctors as well. And again, it offers you a really reliable, really reliable access to medication in situations where you won't always have reliable access to them, especially with supply chain shortages affecting everyone pretty much everywhere. So don't get caught unprepared. Everyone should be empowered to take care of themselves and their loved ones when the unexpected hits. Jace handles everything from online eval to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. So all you have to do to check this out is to go to jacemedical.com and use the code locked on at checkout in order to get a discount on your first purchase. Again, that's JASEmedical.com. Check it out. Alrighty, so let's close things off with the lower section of our consensus comparisons for today's show. We'll talk about some players who have lower than the consensus and why. I think a great starting point here would be Carter Yakemchuk, because I've seen him as high as 6th overall, and he's an honorable mention in our Dobber Prospects rankings. Let's talk about him a bit and what mainly came out of our discussion with Luke as well, because I'm kind of on the same page. He'd probably be at the best in my late first round, mainly because this is a player who's very toolsy. The production's really ridiculous. I mean, look at the production and you're really impressed, and for good reason. I mean, he's got a really good shot. He's able to put pucks on net regularly, and does so in ways that makes them hard to block as well. And that's how most of his points have come out this season. But the main issue, and I think the main name that came to mind regularly when talking about Carter Yakemchuk with Luke, was Jeff Petrie. But not necessarily in the best way. I mean, Jeff Petrie is a bona fide, in his prime was a top pairing defenseman who could do a bit of everything. But with Carter Yakemchuk, you're getting a player who by default shoots into shins. By default tries to create off his stick rather than delegating to his teammates, and isn't necessarily the most active blue line mover. But on top of that, I mean, he's a big body. He's a physical specimen. He's an athlete, but doesn't really use it to his advantage, right? I mean, we're talking about a player who maybe hits once or twice per game and doesn't really do it in kind of projectable ways that would work against NHL forecheckers. I mean, it's just, he's a bit all over the place, isn't he?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of chaos to his game, especially in the defensive zone.
Yeah.
I think in the offensive zone, there's definitely a lot to overhaul there. I'm kind of curious to see how his trend moves this season because,
Mhm.
I mean, last season we also had a player that was getting top 10 love early on the season, who was toolsy and in the offensive zone would only shoot from the blue line, rarely activate, rarely try to switch angles, and was quite limited with the puck on his stick offensively, but was still getting every minute, every power play minute, every offensive opportunity, and that tanked his stock. By
Yeah.
contrast, in Cam Allen
Mhm.
and Yakemchuk, the viewings I've had this season haven't been too dissimilar from Cam Allen last year
Yeah.
in terms of output. Input's quite different between the two, but that said, the big difference between the two right now, at least on the stat sheets, is the production. And Yakimchuk is producing a ton, whereas Allen's production dried up. And I'm kind of curious to see how that will affect the draft ranking and the draft stock relative to last year's example, because Yakimchuk is more in the mold of the traditional valued defenseman. He's big, he can look quite strong in certain sequences. He's a decent skater, right? Like he's a right shot, big thing right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wouldn't have been banging the table for him inside our first round. Like there's a reason that I didn't bring him up as a name that I was really personally invested in having in our top 32 this early on. I
Yeah.
think having him inside our honorable mentions was important. That said, but yeah, he I think that Luke's like lack or no Luke's enthusiasm for not having Yakimchuk inside our top 32 based on his principle as a scout of like just it paining him to do it
Yeah.
was enough to kind of disincentivize us from pushing for Yakimchuk that high. But
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, he's a
No,
funny
fully
player.
agreed. Absolutely. But that brings us to Artyom Levshunov, who we have ranked, I believe, what was it, 11th overall, 10th overall? Let me
10th
just go
overall, I believe.
check.
Yeah,
10th overall, yeah. With Levshunov, I mean, he's a player who, a lot of consensus rankings have in the top 5, top 6, that kind of range. We were a bit more hesitant with that, and we ended up with him at 10th overall. And I fully understand it. I mean, he's a player who, even though he's putting up decent points in the NCAA, that comes with a caveat. He's playing in one of the weaker divisions of college hockey, and he's playing top minutes on their program. He's their top defenseman, playing in every situation. The decision making's really wonky. There are times where he looks like a top 3 lock with really intelligent, passing, really intelligent breakout plays, and overall just facilitates play for his teammates. But there's other games where his decision making looks more like a second or third rounder. So it's just that inconsistency already that puts him in that kind of conversation of players who are probably lower in our consensus than we'd like to have them. Because the toolkit's really interesting. I mean, he's a rangy, big, strong defenseman, decent skating stride. There's a bit of stiffness to his game, but overall, he covers ice really well. Not the most comfortable on puck. There are moments where he tries to deke, and he so clearly does not have that in his
yeah.
repertoire. But I feel like he's a player who could eventually facilitate, simplify his game in ways that really help him. I just There are players ahead of him that just really deserve their ranking, and with Levshunov, even at 10, we're both kind of like, right?
Yeah, I think like well, the big reason that he landed at 10 specifically was because our USA scout David Sod kind of put his foot down. Was like, this is a player I need inside the top 10 for myself, and I was like, yeah,
Yeah,
cool. Like he was gonna land at either 11 or 12 if he wasn't inside our top 10 anyways.
for
And
sure.
the main question there was the order between Levshunov and Salayev, but in the end, the composed decision making that we see in flashes with Levshunov trumped Salayev's still very, very raw decision making on the ice.
Yeah,
And I think I personally would have had them the other way around. But I mean, they're back to back, so I really can't complain here.
for sure. And speaking of which, I mean, we have Cole Eiserman at 5th overall, which is definitely lower than a lot of scouting teams have him.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been second overall or top 3 in almost every scouting ranking that I've seen so far. And for me, what really keeps him out of that conversation is that he's a specialist in the pure sense of the term. He does one thing extremely well, and it's score goals. And he does it in two ways. He either just rifles a puck past players off the rush and just beats goalies clean, or he finds space in the offensive zone and one times a puck. And that's great to have that in your repertoire, to be the best goal scorer in this draft by a decent margin. But I don't really see anything that leads into the offensive zone that I like from Cole Eiserman. He's a big body, but doesn't use it really well. Not the most outstanding skater. His rush patterns are weird. He tends to try to like drive wide on opponents a lot when he carries the puck, and that's not even often. Oftentimes, all he does is just pass a puck to James Higgins and lets him work his magic in the NTDP. And defensively,
Which,
you're not
fair
really
enough.
getting much out of him. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. It's James Higgins. Like he's one of the most dynamic puck carries you can get, but still, I think with Eiserman, it's just that there's really nothing outside of his goal scoring that I can point to and call a strength. But it's just he's the best goal scorer in this draft, so that keeps him in the top 5. But yeah, it's a bit weird with him. But that wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They're a 24-hour news channel that is available to you anytime you want, and they keep you updated on what's going on in sports. And make sure to tune in for our shows next week as we continue our breakdown for the month of November. This has been Hadi Kalakash with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.